Hey, what is up guys, and welcome to yet another 3D pilot video. It's been quite a busy week. I've got a couple of deadlines going on, but today I want to talk about the fourth key to making photorealistic product renders. So there's a couple of things that go into making a photorealistic render, and the very first thing would be the modeling. So when you're making a model, it's very important to have a realistic model that is detailed enough. That's very important. You need all the shapes to be possible, so don't make floating things or things that are impossibly thin, because those will look really fake in the final rendering. Also, like I taught you in how to render in SolidWorks, there's a great feature to fillet all the edges, because in the real world there's no 100% sharp edges. You also want to match your model to the material properties, because there's very few materials, except for maybe plastics, that can be made into any shape. So if you've got wood, for example, you can cut wood, but you can't form it into really complex 3D objects, for example. Or when you've got paper, that can only bend in one direction. Metal, you've got sheet metal, you've got extruded metal. But there's always a link between the material and the model that you make. So you have to think about it and make your model look logical. The second thing you need is good materials. So to make materials that are pleasant to look at and that look real, you want to use some interesting textures. And you want to plug those into a PBR rendering engine. Now, there's a couple of ways to think about PBR. If you want to know more about PBR, by the way, check the link in the description. There's a great video there by Blender Guru. And he'll talk a little bit more about what PBR is and why it's important. But basically, it's a set of instructions that your computer gets to render an image that looks really, really realistic, and to make materials that are, well, that match the real world. Also, something that's often overlooked is to make your materials a little bit dirty, because if you go to SolidWorks, for example, and you apply any material, basically, they're always perfectly clean, perfectly smooth. While if you have a look at the real world, just take something, the nearest thing that's laying next to you, and have a good look at it. There's probably some dust on it, maybe some fingerprints, some grease, some scratches. There's always little details. And you can implement those in your render. That gives a really nice result. The third key you need is good lighting. Lighting can be a little bit hard to get a grip on, but there's a bunch of great tutorials out there, and you can look at product photography, because many things that we do in renders are actually related to how you work with lights and cameras and lenses in actual photo studios. So one good way of using lighting is by using photospheres, like 360-degree photographic globes that light your model. Also, check links in the description if you want to know more about that. It's very important that you think about how the light shines upon your model, but also if the environment is reflecting in your model, for example. You can use the 3-point lighting technique, also links in the description. This is a very common used lighting technique, using a key light, a fill light, and a rim light that's often used in studios. Also, you want to think about making your lights colored, because no lights in the real world are 100% white. And also think about the perspective, the camera angles, the depth of field, those kind of things are important. And also, after making your render, it's really cool to go into post-processing and add some filters, add some dirt on top of it, add some noise. That can actually make your render look more pleasing and more realistic. So that's just a couple of things to keep in mind. Now, pretty much any software can do all of these things. If you go to Keyshot, or if you go to any of the other like Octane or V-Ray, or all these rendering types, and of course Cycles, that's in Blender as well, can all do those things. PhotoView works a little bit different. PhotoView is not using a ray tracing engine. Don't worry about that, what that means. But the reason I'm making this video is actually because Visualize is now coming up in SolidWorks. So programs like Visualize or any other rendering program can do all of these things. You can have great models, import those. You can add some really realistic materials and have some really intricate lighting, and also have the PBR shading and the photorealistic rendering thing. You'll see a lot of marketing about that, a lot of fuss going on. But in my opinion, all these things are great, but there's something really important missing, and this is what this video is about. Let's have a look at a couple of examples. So for example, here we've got a Super Nintendo controller, which has got some really great detailed materials. You can see those. You've got some nice lighting going on. I have to be honest on that. And it's on a grayish background. Here we've got some cast metal parts, which look very shiny. Maybe not the most realistic material, but there's some fine lighting. You can see all the details. So it's a fine render. Here's a rough shoe. It's got some nice materials on it as well. Some interesting textures. How about this? That's like cosmetics packaging, prototype render kind of thing. Looks great. It looks really simple. Hasn't got a lot of textures on it, but it works fine. It's on a grey background. Here you've got a drill, which is maybe the materials are a bit weird. You've got some detail, but maybe the detail isn't looking very natural. But yeah, there's that. There's this headphones as well. It's got some nice lighting reflections inside those lighting cones, and well, it's on a white background. Here you've got a little gas tank with some prototype thingy concept on there. I'm not sure what this is all about. I didn't make these renders, by the way, so this is not to offend anyone that I'm showing these renders. It's just I think we can learn from them. So yeah. But what I wanted to say is this is a gas tank and it's on a grayish blue background. Here's some fun little retro radios, if I'm correct, which look nice. They've got nice colors, some nice shapes, and they're on a white background. Here's a little furniture concept that you've got. And here's a toy train that's on a green background. I think you might understand what I'm getting at here. The renders that were made here look fine. They work. They've got great materials, sometimes great lighting, but they're still kind of boring. They're just on a plain background. And because of this, these images aren't really believable. You can easily see that's a render, that's fake, that's made in a computer. Can you show me some pictures or a prototype? They're not really convincing. There's often no feeling, no story, because the lighting is quite plain and really boring. And because you haven't got a believable image, this is clearly not photorealistic. No matter how good your rendering engine is, I mean, Visualize is actually really great at ray tracing. It's really fast, it's got noise reduction, it's got everything. But it still renders things on a plain background. Let's have a look at some different examples. For example, this SodaStream thing, you can still make out that it's a render because the resolution isn't quite matching and maybe lighting isn't perfect. But you can see it's used in a kitchen. It's on a place where it's supposed to be. It's a modern kitchen, so that fits. Here you've got that little plant thing. I can't even be sure this is a render, but that's what you get when you do photorealistic rendering. You can't really see the difference between what's in the photo and what's your rendered product sometimes. But here you've got this little planter thing, which looks really nice. It's in the sink, it's in the kitchen. Okay, it's a nice place. Here's a little bowl, a fruit bowl made by IKEA. Now this is no accident that I took something from IKEA, because pretty much 70% of what you see in the IKEA catalog are renders. You might mistake those. The people are real. The food is most of the time real, although I'm quite sure these apples are actually 3D models as well. I can't tell for sure. But a lot of things are renders, because it's just a lot cheaper to do rendering than hiring a photographer, making a studio, doing all the lighting. When you have to do something again, you don't have to remake the whole studio again. You can just pop some different colors, pop some different materials in there, have some different lighting conditions really quickly in 3D, and you can't do that in the real world. So IKEA uses a lot of rendering here. This is a little example of a lamp scene. I think this is a really nice one, where you've got these candles and this little cozy scene in the middle of the table. Now this simple render is one render that I made last year. I'll tell you a little bit more how I made this one a couple slides further. And for example, here I've got a little pincer for taking salads, I suppose. I don't think this is a render, but I just wanted to show that it's still on a white background, but you've got some hands in there, you've got some interaction, and it really looks like someone is using that tool. And now you can imagine clearly how big it feels, how it will work, how it would clamp together. If you just had the pincers like that, without anything, that wouldn't be a believable image at all. Here's another one that I made in my first bachelor year, of a little clock that's sitting on a bedside table. It's got some nice lighting going on in the inside. Now this is one of my very first renders that I made, so it hasn't got a lot of detail, but it's still a little bit more believable because the lighting matches how the clock will be used. And here's another one from last year, which was made using cardboard cutouts and 3D prints that these girls were holding. And we took pictures of the girls with those prototypes in hand, and then replaced those prototypes with renders. That way we could make a really nice image. And this is the fourth key that I'm getting at. To have a believable image, you need interaction with the environment. You can't just have the product on a plain background. There's a couple of ways you can do this. An in situ render is just when you place a product in a certain environment. Like you have a chair and you would put it somewhere in the living or something on a table. It's just a product that you put in a location. You can have things that are worn on the body, so like pieces of clothing or maybe earphones or glasses or something, some personal container kind of thing. And you've got products, that's maybe the most common, products that are in the hands of your users. So that's something I often do. I take my product and put them in the hands of users. Maybe a little prototype that I give them, take a couple of pictures, and then replace those prototypes with renders in post-processing. Now this is a little harder to do. I've got a little example here. We've got this reciprocating saw, and you can quite clearly see that it's a render. Now there's some shadow that's falling on top of the table, that's fine. But you can see that the resolution doesn't quite match, the depth of field isn't really present. The model is also lit a little bit weird, and the temperature of the render is a little bit too bluish, too cold. You can quite clearly see the distinction. For example, this car, it's a great car model and it's quite a fine picture. You could use that picture for sure, but the lighting doesn't match at all. You can see in this picture very clearly that the light comes from the left, but the car is lit from somewhere at the back, at the front. The lighting isn't matching at all, and the reflection is also really weird, because if you listen to the reflection, the car would be floating like 30 centimeters above the ground. So it's a good try. But there's still some work to do on this one. This is another example. Here you've got great perspective going on, and the lighting is quite fine, but you can see that the resolution doesn't match, and the materials are really clean and really fine, and there isn't a lot of detail going on. So it's definitely a hard thing to do, this interaction thing, but it is really important, and it's definitely worth checking out. The very first thing you have to do when you want to match a render with a photo is, of course, perspective. It's especially important when you place a product in a certain environment. So for example, this is a little screenshot in Blender where someone was trying to render this vase on top of a table. And they actually made a plane that's as big as the table, and then just tossed the camera around, rotated it, scaled it up, changed the angles until the plane was completely fitting with the table. And that way, anything you put on that table will be in the right perspective, the right amount of distortion. And the second really important thing is to have matching lighting. Because if you render something out, there's a lot of lighting going on, there's shadows, there's reflections, and you need to think about those. There's two main things to consider. There are lighting effects that are on the 3D model that come from outside, and there's lighting effects that are on the photo that are cast into the photo by the product that you are trying to render. Let's give a little example. These are some examples of where the rendered object is casting shadows and lighting on the rest of the image. So here I'm thinking shadows, there's reflections, and there's lighting. For example, you've got this little vase, you rendered out this vase. There's a little shadow cast on top of the plank. Let's say that the plank is a photo here. So you need to replicate that shadow. And you've got a phone on top of a table, and the phone, even though you can't see it that clearly, if you look at it for a while, you can clearly see that there's a reflection from the phone on the table. The table is a photo, and you didn't take a picture of a real phone. There's no reflection, so you have to add that in later. And here a really clear example, which is an IKEA lamp, and it's clearly casting light on top of the whole scene. This is a little bit harder to do, so if you wanted to make a render like this, for example, I'd suggest you use a real lamp, maybe a cone-shaped lamp, to light your scene, and then replace it with a render. And so you have natural light and shadows. You can add those in Photoshop as well, or maybe even with some 3D techniques, but that would take a lot more work and wouldn't still look as good. So as I said, I'm coming back to this render. Here you can see someone holding this little cone, this marble cone. That is actually lit up, and you can see that there's light casted on top of her fingers. So the way we did this is we actually made a little paper model which has a lamp inside. We turned on that lamp, and that would actually light the fingers, and then we would replace it back with the rendered marble image. And then we added some shadows and reflections to make the hand look a little bit more realistic, but that's basically how we did that. So that's all lighting effects that come from your 3D model and go into the rest of your photo. But there's also the opposite thing. Everything that's in your photo actually reflects on your 3D model. Also, I'm thinking shadow, reflections, and other lighting effects. So for example, if I'm designing a mouse, it'd be nice to have a render of the mouse that's in a hand. You can also 3D model a hand, but I don't know if you have ever tried that. It's really hard to make that look realistic. So you take a picture of a hand, and you want to combine that picture with a render of your mouse. You definitely have to think about the shadow that's from the photo, your hand, casted on top of your 3D model, the shadow right there. If I made a concept for a drawing tablet, for example, that's got a glass surface, you definitely need that reflection. It wouldn't look very natural without it. So this thing you can probably do by placing a mirror before taking a picture, and then replace that mirror with your tablet, and then maybe darken the reflection a little bit, but that is how you do that. You can also take a picture from the other side, but that would be a little bit hard. Or when the reflection is a lot more blurry, you wouldn't do that here, because the image is really sharp. But if you've got a really blurry reflection, you can use a 3D model of a hand, for example, and have that be reflected to have realistic enough reflections and lighting and shadows and colors. Now, for example, if I wanted to make this shot, the image that you can see here, not what would be taken by the camera on the tripod over there, but if I wanted to render those books that are in the middle, you would actually light those books with a big square light on top and maybe a smaller light that's further back somewhere. But you want to replicate what's in the real world and replicate it in 3D to light your model. I hope that makes sense. And if you think about all these lighting effects going from your model on top of your environment and in the opposite way, you can make some really awesome renders that are really believable and look really good. And I think that's what photorealism is about. It's when you look at a picture and can't immediately tell if it's a render or not. So the big question is, how do you do this? Well, it's easy. You just make the whole environment in 3D. For example, if I wanted to make a little coffee table, I just model the rest of the living room, have the lighting like that, and everything will reflect in everything, and everything will have natural shadows because there's only one light source, the sun, and that will just look great. And yeah, no, we're not gonna do that. That takes a lot of time. So what do? It's really simple. We use pictures. We take a picture that's of good quality, so that's good lighting, there's not too much noise, and there's a good resolution. And then we use that picture as a background for our render. So we take a picture, take a render, and put that on top. Now, many of you have probably done that before, but forgot to think about that lighting and the shadow and the reflections, because these are really important. You have to make sure that these are right to have a believable image. So you have to think how about how your 3D model casts shadows and reflections in the rest of the image, but also how the image and the lighting that's in your photo reflects in your 3D model. And then if needed, you would add some extra geometry. For example, if I'm making a product that sits on a table, I will add an actual plane for the table that can take reflections from my 3D object and take shadows. And then I can, with some different rendering layers, composite it in Photoshop. Now this depends on the software you're using, on the possibilities you have, and on your skills with Photoshop or GIMP or whatever image editing software you're using. But yeah, it's a good technique to combine these 3D elements and 2D elements together. And you have to use Photoshop or something similar when you've rendered. You can't just put a render on a photo and expect it to look realistic. No, you need to match the lighting, you need to match color temperature, white balance. There's a couple of things you need to do to make this look good. But it's of course a little bit hard. It isn't that easy to do. So I'm ending this video with a proposal for a next video. There's a bunch of different scenarios depending on what kind of render you're making. But I'm interested in making a tutorial on making a photorealistic render using a photo as a background. So that can be in situ, just placing something on a location, having something worn on a person's body, or maybe have something in hand, rendered in hand. So yeah, if you're interested, let me know. Please let me know what kind of render you'd like to see, what kind of product, what kind of lighting scenario. Maybe post a screenshot of a scene that you'd like me to recreate and have a little look at what goes into one of these photorealistic renders. As I said, I can't give like general rules because this video would be very long. There's a lot of different aspects that go into photorealistic rendering. But yeah, if you're interested, please do let me know in the comments below or on my Facebook page on 3D Pilot. If you've got any questions, of course, leave them in the comments. Post a screenshot, which is always a great way to show your problem real clearly. Or if you want, you can send something via Messenger to 3D Pilot. I've been getting a couple of questions on my personal Facebook. Which is fine, I still answer you, but I prefer it if you do it via 3D Pilot, because then I keep all my comments in a nice place and have it all together, and it's just a little bit easier to keep track of. So yeah, I'll see you next week with another video. Remember that the competition for having a 3D textured model printed and delivered to your door for free is still going on. So you can still send in your model, no matter what it is. It just has to be a textured 3D model. You can texture it in SolidWorks. I prefer it if you do it in Blender, but it's up to you. You can use any software you want, but I don't want any models with just plain colors. You need some textures on there. And then just send in a screenshot and have a look at maybe my last video. I'll link it in the description for all the details. So yeah, maybe you've got a nice 3D print in color to put on the shelf and be proud of. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next week. Bye.